Hello, fifth grade. We are ready to start lesson 78 in science. You might have noticed we skipped over lesson 77. That was just an experiment with the spring scale, which we can't really do right now. So we're going to skip over that and go to lesson 78, which is contact forces involving fluids. Okay, so remember, contact forces means they are touching. Okay, and we talked about some contact forces with solids like friction. And now we're going to talk about fluids. So that's going to be liquid and gas. This is what we're talking about with fluids. Okay. So if you open your booklet to page 10 or scroll up to page 10 if you're using the digital copy, you can see a chart on page 10 that says contact forces involving fluids, liquids, and gases. And the first force on there is buoyancy. Okay, and buoyancy is the force opposing gravity exerted on an object placed in a fluid. So that's kind of like what makes objects float on top of the water is their buoyancy. So gravity is going to pull the objects in the fluid downward. Buoyancy is working against it. It's pushing them up. Okay, so it causes a cork to float in water. That's called buoyancy. And it also causes a helium balloon to float in the air. Okay, so that buoyancy is going to work against the gravity to get the balloon to float. Okay, and then the second force on the chart is drag. And drag is the force that resists motion of an object through a fluid. Okay, so like air resistance would be a type of drag. So instead of just moving through the air quickly, drag is pushing back on you, so it makes it harder to move through that air. So that's why airplanes are designed the way they are, and they have the little parts on their wings that go up like this to resist the drag and all kinds of stuff. All the different parts. Okay, so if you try to run through water, if you've ever tried that before, you know it's kind of hard. You can't just push through water the same way you can air. So that is also drag. That's pushing you back. And if you run into wind, you'll experience the same thing. That's drag. So it's moving in the opposite direction of the direction you're moving. Okay? And there's another experiment that I can't do right now, but if you have playing cards at home, that's probably any kind of card, really. If you hold it up in the air and then drop it down, you'll see it kind of floats its way down like this. So that's a way to experiment with drag and see how it's working. The card's not just going to fall straight down. It's going to kind of resist through the air a little slowly, and it'll probably go faster than my hand is right now, but it's still going to have some drag on it. Okay. And the way it's shaped is going to affect the drag too. If you drop it straight like this, it's going to fall much faster than if you drop it this direction, if it's parallel to the floor. Okay, now the third force on the chart is lift. Okay, and lift is the force a moving fluid exerts as it flows around an object. Okay, so basically it's how it kind of moves around it. That's lift. So when wind blows leaves on the ground, it lifts them up. That's lift. It's lifting up. So that's pretty easy one to understand. When water flows around rocks in a stream, it's able to lift the rocks and move them downstream in that erosion movement. That is lift also, with the waters lifting them up. Okay, lift is going to be perpendicular to the applied force. So that's what's causing it to lift up. So lift is often described as an upward force. It can also be a down force. Air moving under a race car moves faster than air above it, creating down force or negative lift on the car. Okay? So if you ever watched a race car, that air underneath is going much faster than the air that goes over it. Okay? The fourth force is thrust. And thrust is the force of a fluid opposing a force applied by a propeller, turbine, rocket, or other object. Okay, so when air is moved backward by the engine on a plane, the plane moves in the opposite direction of the movement of the air. So I know that's kind of a difficult one to understand. So basically, the airplane's moving forward, the thrust is going this way. So if you think of like a boat, like a propeller and engine on a boat, it's going that way. So you can see water pushing out the back side of the boat, but the boat is moving this way. Same thing with an airplane. The airplane's moving this way. The engine is shooting out air and hot air in that direction. Okay. And when you swim, your hands push against the water. So the force of the water against your hands is allowing you to move forward. You're pushing. That's thrust. Okay. Then if we look at the diagram at the bottom of that page, on page 10, the picture shows how the forces of drag, lift, thrust, and weight affect an airplane. So an airplane actually uses a lot of different forces on it to get it to move the way it does. Because obviously to keep an object that large in the air is going to require a lot of force. Okay, so if you look at that picture, Ethan in the background there, the forces acting on an airplane as it is flying are, number one, it's thrust because the engines are pushing the opposite direction of the airplane. Number two is lift because of the shape of the wings. And number three is drag of the force of air against the plane as it moves forward through the air. So that's pushing against it, right? And then number four is weight because of gravity. So even though that plane is way up in the air, it's still got gravity pushing down on it, right? Or pulling it down, I should say. Okay, and then there's also a slideshow to check out on this one on the Nancy Larson website. It's going to be lesson 78, slideshow A, contact forces fluids. So if you scroll through that, I'll give you the password and everything again so you can check that out. Lesson 78, slideshow A. So that's going to be fluids. And then you'll see on your chart in your booklet, it's going to have an example of each contact force in the slideshow. So if you have it printed out, if you want to write it next to the example as you're going through the slideshow, that'll give you a good way to remember what each of those forces are. Okay, and then the second slideshow for lesson 78 is going to show how organisms use contact forces in fluids. Okay, so how things use them. So on slideshow B, you're going to watch that one too and read the captions of how they use contact forces in fluids. Okay, so there's really not anything to highlight for today. There's just that chart to fill out. You can always highlight on your own if there's a certain word you want to remember. You can do that. But the main thing to remember, your contact forces with fluids. You have your buoyancy that's pushing it up, allowing it to float. Drag is pushing against whatever's moving through the fluid. Okay, you have lift, which is lifting up like the leaves on the ground when the wind blows. That's lift. And you have thrust, which is going to move in the opposite direction of how it goes. Okay, so that's like your engines and your propellers. They're pushing things out this way to get it to go the opposite direction. Okay, so those are the main contact forces we talked about today. So once you're ready, you can go ahead and complete lesson review 78 in Google Classroom as well. And don't forget to watch those slideshows.